This, my friends, is the Aprilia Tuareg 660, a beautiful looking bike from a premium Italian manufacturer with bags of brilliant features. And yet it only costs just over 10.5 grand, which I think is excellent bang for your buck. So in this video, I'm going to tell you absolutely everything that you need to know about it with my 9 favorite features. Now, all of the on-bike footage is shot today with this, the Insta360 X3. It's a brilliant little device if you want a bit more variety in your social media posts, and personally I think it's a lot more creative to use something like this than a regular old school action cam like a GoPro. Now, what I really love about it is that it's so easy to use, because you can just set the camera running and then use their awesome app after your ride to frame the clip. Plus you can choose between landscape or portrait, zoom in or zoom out, and so you never really have to worry about the camera being absolutely perfectly positioned. So if you like some of the shots you can see in this video, then I definitely recommend heading to the link in the description where you can find out more. And once again, a massive thanks to Insta360 for their support. Now, number 1 is the engine, and this parallel twin 660cc is pretty much the same as you'll find in their RS660 sports bike and the Tuareg 660 semi-naked. Now, those two bikes were launched before this and they were super popular, with the engine being a major part of that. Plenty of power, plenty of torque, and it's got that 270-degree crank, which gives it a bit of a V-twin vibe. But in this adventure bike, they've made a few adaptations, and I think it makes it even better, at least for road riding. It gets a new tune with different cam profiles that gives it more valve lift and less valve overlap, and the result is more torque lower in the rev range. So whilst you do sacrifice a little bit of like peaky top end power, there's more grunt in that usable rev range, and so on the road it really does feel quite plucky. But on top of that, not only does it have a bit more punch, but also they've shortened the final drive ratios, so potentially a bigger rear sprocket or smaller front, or both. And in the gearbox itself, there's a shorter first gear, so that sort of doubles up the effect. More torque and a shorter final drive ratio leads to a very lively and fun feeling bike to ride. But look, it's not all frivolity and fun, because there's some good practical features on this bike, chief amongst which is the 18-litre fuel tank. That's 3 litres up on the road bias variants, so the RS and the Tuono, but also 2 litres more than its closest competitor, the Tenere 700 from Yamaha. Now, both bikes do get a similar fuel economy. In fact, the T7 is actually slightly worse if you go by the official consumption figures, and so combined with that extra 2 litres on top, if you want the bike that can do the biggest range between fuel stops, then probably the Tuareg is the one to look at. I will say though, if you can find a little bit more cash, there is the World Raid variant of the Tenere 700. That's long distance bias, so it gets a massive 23-litre tank. But if you want something that's a nice compromise between, decent fuel range, but also still fairly slender, then again, the Tuareg is it. Now, number 3 is the transmission. It's got a really nice gearbox and also a nice light lever action for the clutch. And so while there is a quick shifter accessory, I think it's only 185 quid, so that's a decent deal. If you're able to shift clutchlessly, I don't think you necessarily need it. It's a really sweet gearbox, a lovely clutch to use, and so for me, that's another big plus of this bike. Number 4 is the sound of this bike. I already mentioned that all of the 660s from Aprilia get that 270-degree crank, which gives it a nice growly roar. And so here's a little bit of footage that I captured earlier with the Insta360. Thing is, nowadays we've got such limiting emissions regulations from the likes of Euro 5 that the exhaust system is always going to be a little bit muffled and quiet. But the great thing about this bike is that up here around the cockpit, where you're actually spending most of your time when you're riding the bike, you've got plenty of induction roar, especially when you give it plenty of throttle. It really does have quite a deep bassy note, and so for me that's a big plus. You don't really spend much time hanging around at the back of the exhaust here, but where you do spend your time, you do get a very nice soundtrack to your ride. Now on top of that beautiful soundtrack, another thing that makes this bike quite fun to ride, especially when you start pushing it a bit, is the fact that it's not particularly weighty. It comes in at 204 kilograms curb, and granted that is exactly the same as the Tenere 700, so it's not really a competitive advantage, but if you like the idea of the versatility of an adventure bike, the ability to tour, the ability to ride off-road, the ability to do the sporty riding too, but maybe you're put off by the big weight figures on some of those large capacity adventure bikes, then definitely consider this, because 204 kilograms is pretty much equivalent to like a middleweight sporty naked. But also, on top of that relatively slender weight, the handling on this bike is actually surprisingly good. And I say that because it's got all the hallmarks of a bike that would be excellent off-road, but not necessarily on. Things like the relatively long travel suspension, so you've got 240mm of travel front and rear and 240mm of ground clearance, so it really is quite a tall bike. You've got the 21-inch spoke front wheel as well, which is typically great for rolling over rougher surfaces, but maybe not so much on the road feel. And also you've got Pirelli Scorpion Rally STR tires, so that semi-knobbly vibe. But actually, you know, the suspension is relatively firm, so it does feel composed, and you've got full adjustability front and rear, so you can really get it dialed in and firm things up for sportier road riding, should you so wish. And also those tires, despite the appearance, they're actually pretty good on the road. They might look like gravel and off-road tires, but they do hold their own, even like today when it's a little bit damp. Plus the chassis setup and the geometry feels nice and lively, and overall I'd say the handling on this bike, certainly on the road, I haven't had much chance to try it off-road today, but on the road, it's impressive. Now let's have a look down here at the braking setup, because for me this is another standout point of this bike. You get 300mm front discs, which are about 20mm bigger than the Tenere 700, so a little bit more braking power, and also Brembo calipers and a Brembo master cylinder. So I think it's a really nice balance. There's enough power there for when you're riding slightly quicker on the road, but also it's not so aggressive that it's going to lock up all the time and feel too bitey when you're riding on looser surfaces like gravel or mud. Now back up to the cockpit, and number 8 for this bike is the technology. There's plenty of features for a bike at this price point. You've got a 5-inch color TFT dash through which you can manage 4 riding modes, so Explore, Urban, Off-Road and Individual. Those 2 are customizable. And within that you've got 4 levels of traction control, 3 levels of engine braking, 3 power maps, and then ABS can be fully on at the front and off at the rear, or fully disabled depending on how confident you feel riding off-road. But look, the biggest one for me, and it's a massive deal for me on a bike that you could do a bit of distance work on, is the fact that it's got cruise control. The Tenere 700 and also the new Transalp from Honda, the new V-Strom 800DE from Suzuki, they're all bikes you can spec with luggage and a decent windscreen, and yet none of those bikes come with cruise control, whereas this does, and it's really nicely implemented. Quite a lot of bikes get the cruise control button on the right hand switchgear, and it can be difficult to hold your speed with the throttle and then reach for the button, so it's great to see it over on the left hand switchgear where it should be. And like I say, this is a big strength for me of this bike if you're doing distance work versus the competition. Plus you've got the phone connectivity in the dash, and you've got LED lighting all round, and so it makes for what I would say is a really strong tech package for 10.5 grand. And that for me is feature number 9. I think the price point is really good for such a desirable bike with such an extensive set of features. The only 2 bikes that might spoil the party a little bit are the Transalp and V-Strom that I mentioned that got launched at EICMA last week. Pricing is yet to be announced for those, so they'll have to be quite aggressive to look like good value versus these. But if you want to see a full walk around of each bike, we shot it there in Milan last week, and I'll link to them here. So check them out and enjoy, and let us know what you think of them down in the comments. And once again, a massive thanks to Insta360 for their support. They've got a massive sale on at the moment, so do check out the X3 camera through the links in the description.